The courtroom was tense as the black disabled man sat quietly in the defendant's chair, his hands resting on his lap. He looked calm, though many could see the years of struggle written on his face. The judge, a middle-aged woman, stood at her podium, her eyes scanning through the documents in front of her. She glanced up at the man, her gaze dismissive, almost mocking. Her cold attitude was clear to everyone in the room. She had a reputation for being harsh, especially when dealing with cases that involved people from marginalized communities. As the court proceedings continued, the man remained seated, his head slightly tilted down. He had dealt with prejudice all his life, and although this particular trial was supposed to be about a minor offense, it was clear that the judge's demeanor was more about personal bias than the facts. The judge, seeing him sitting there, assumed he would not challenge her authority. She smirked to herself, thinking that she had the upper hand. The prosecutor, a young woman, glanced nervously between the judge and the man. She knew the judge was harsh, but hadn't expected this level of disdain. The defense attorney, an older man with gray hair, sighed and exchanged a glance with the defendant. He could see the weight of the man's past hanging over him, but he knew there was something more to this man than what anyone could see on the surface. The judge continued, her voice sharp and unyielding. "This court does not tolerate disrespect, and your actions have shown a lack of regard for authority," she said, pointing a finger at the man in an almost theatrical manner. "You sit there with your defiant silence, but you are not fooling anyone. The law will have its way." The man didn't respond, his lips pressed together. He felt the sting of the judge's words, but he was prepared for this moment. Years of being underestimated had led him to this exact situation. He knew how the world saw him, and he had learned long ago that the only way to truly stand up for himself was to show them all who he really was without a word. The judge scoffed, turning back to the prosecutor. "I have seen enough of these cases. People like him think they can hide behind their conditions. They think we can't see their true character," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The air in the courtroom felt thick, as if time itself had paused. The black disabled man, who had been quietly sitting there, suddenly stood up. The judge paused, her gaze shifting from the prosecutor to the defendant, and then to the man as he slowly rose from his seat. A ripple of shock ran through the courtroom as the man, with an air of calm confidence, straightened his back. The simple action of standing, something that would have seemed trivial to most, had a profound effect on everyone in the room. The judge's smirk faltered as she looked at him. The man was not just standing. He was revealing something much deeper, something that no one had expected. As he stood tall, the silence grew heavier. His hands were steady as he adjusted his jacket, and for the first time, his eyes met the judge's. There was no fear in his gaze, no hesitation. Instead, there was a deep understanding, a knowing that he was far more than what anyone had assumed. The judge's smirk slowly faded into a look of confusion. She didn't know what to make of it. Her initial assumptions about him were shattering right before her eyes, and for the first time, she realized that the man in front of her was not just a disabled black man, but someone who had the strength and power to stand up, not just physically, but in every sense of the word. The room was filled with silence, but it was not the kind of silence that could be ignored. The judge's eyes widened as she stared at the man who had stood before her, his body now rigid with purpose. The prosecutor looked stunned, her mouth slightly open in disbelief. No one in the courtroom had expected this. The defendant, the man they had all thought was just another person to dismiss, was now standing, looking confident and assertive. The judge, clearly taken off guard, cleared her throat, trying to regain her composure. "What is this?" she muttered, her voice quivering slightly. It was a question no one had expected. The man, standing tall, gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if he was aware of the shift in the room. For a brief moment, he didn't speak, allowing the weight of his silence to hang in the air. Everyone waited, unsure of what was going to happen next. The man knew this was his moment. He had prepared for it. not in the way one might prepare for a confrontation, but rather with the quiet knowledge that this was his chance to show the truth of who he was. He took a deep breath, and with a calm voice that resonated throughout the courtroom, he began to speak. "You think you know who I am, but you don't. You judge me by the color of my skin and by the fact that I am disabled," he said, his words carrying an undeniable strength. "But what you fail to understand is that I am more than what you see in front of you." The judge's hand gripped the edge of her podium. Her face was unreadable, but she could feel a shift in the room. The tension that had once been only in the air now seemed to permeate every corner of the courtroom. The man's voice was steady, and as he spoke, he made sure everyone was paying attention. "I have lived a life of challenges, yes, but those challenges have shaped me into something stronger than you could ever imagine." He paused for a moment, his gaze scanning the room, meeting the eyes of the jury, the prosecutor, and the judge. No one spoke. They all listened, the gravity of his words pulling them in. "I was born with a disability, and yes, I am black, but those things do not define me. They are just pieces of who I am. You see what you want to see, but you miss the real story. You miss the strength, the resilience, the heart of a person who has fought every single day of his life to prove that I deserve respect, just like anyone else." The judge's fingers tightened around the papers in front of her. She had been expecting a meek, apologetic response from the man, something she could dismiss and move on from. But this was different. She didn't know how to respond to the power in his words. "I didn't come here today for your pity or your judgment," the man continued, his voice now growing more passionate. "I came here to show you that I am no different from anyone else. And if you refuse to see that, then that is your loss." The courtroom was quiet, the air thick with emotion. The judge, who had always prided herself on her ability to control every situation, now found herself unsure of how to proceed. The man's confidence was like a force of nature, impossible to ignore. Her eyes locked with his, and for the first time, she felt a sense of unease. This was no longer just a trial. It had become something more, a challenge to the way things had always been. The prosecutor, who had been silent up until now, exchanged a look with the defense attorney. They both seemed to recognize the shift that had just taken place. This wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about the larger conversation, the one that everyone had been avoiding, the conversation about bias, judgment, and humanity. The judge's fingers trembled slightly as she placed the papers down, her mind racing. She wasn't used to feeling this way, disoriented, caught off guard by someone like him. The black disabled man, standing confidently in front of her, had completely thrown her expectations out the window. She had thought that with her position, her authority, she could control the courtroom. But now, for the first time, she wasn't sure of her power. Her gaze shifted from the man to the rest of the room. The jury, normally stoic and impartial, was now leaning forward, clearly affected by his words. Even the prosecutor, who had once seemed so sure of the case, was now visibly shaken. There was something in the man's presence, something more than his appearance, that demanded respect. The defense attorney, who had been mostly quiet until now, saw the shift as well. He stood up slowly, his voice calm but firm as he addressed the judge. "Your Honor, I believe this man has made his point clear. It's important that we don't let bias cloud our judgment. This case is about more than just the alleged offense. It's about respecting the dignity of every individual, regardless of their background or circumstances." The judge didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked at the man again, her expression softening for a brief moment. His eyes, steady and unwavering, seemed to pierce through her, and for the first time, she felt a small pang of guilt. She had judged him so easily, based on assumptions that she hadn't even realized she was making. The man, still standing tall, finally spoke again, his voice quiet but full of resolve. "I don't need you to apologize. I don't need you to pity me. What I need is for you to understand that I am no different than anyone else in this courtroom. I deserve to be treated with respect, Not just because I'm human, but because I've earned it. I've fought for it every single day of my life." The room remained silent as his words hung in the air. The judge opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. She was struggling now, not to control the courtroom, but to process what was happening. She had seen many cases, but this one felt different. This wasn't just a man on trial. This was a moment that forced her to question everything she had believed in. Her hand moved instinctively, reaching for the gavel, but she paused. The man hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't tried to dominate the room. He had simply spoken his truth, and it was powerful enough to silence everyone around him. The defense attorney took a step forward, sensing the moment was right. "Your Honor, I ask that you look beyond your preconceived notions and focus on the facts. This man is not defined by his disability, nor by the color of his skin. He is a person of value, and he deserves a fair hearing." The judge hesitated, her eyes darting between the defendant and the rest of the courtroom. For a brief moment, she felt the weight of every judgment she had ever passed, every assumption she had ever made. She could feel the eyes of the jury on her now, waiting for her to make a decision, not just about this case, but about the kind of person she wanted to be. The man stood there, unwavering. His calmness had taken away the power from the judge's harsh words. It was no longer about the trial or the verdict. It was about something much deeper. It was about how she, as a judge, could stand in a place of authority, and yet realize she had failed to see the true worth of those who came before her. The judge took a deep breath. The silence in the room felt heavy, but it also felt like a turning point. She had always prided herself on being impartial, but this moment was forcing her to confront something deeper within herself. Would she continue to cling to her old beliefs, or would she choose to see the man standing before her for who he truly was? The judge stood frozen for a moment, her mind struggling to process everything that had just happened. The courtroom, once filled with the sound of formal proceedings, was now entirely silent. The black disabled man, who moments ago had been seen as just another case to dismiss, had taken center stage and commanded the room. His words lingered in the air like a challenge to everyone in the room, but especially to the judge herself. Her heart raced, but her thoughts were clear. The weight of her position suddenly felt heavier, like a burden she hadn't been aware of until now. For years, she had been the one who set the tone in the courtroom, making decisions and passing judgments without question. She had built a reputation based on control and authority. But now, standing before her, was a man who had shown her something she hadn't expected: humility, power, and truth. The defense attorney took a step forward, his voice low but firm. "Your Honor," he began, "this man is not just a defendant. He is a person with a story, a person with dreams, a person who deserves the same fairness and respect as anyone else." He paused, looking at the judge, waiting for her response. "I ask you to think about what truly matters here. Do the facts of this case outweigh the truth of this man's life?" The prosecutor, still in shock, seemed at a loss for words. She had been prepared for a routine trial, but this was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Her eyes flicked from the judge to the defendant. She wasn't sure how to navigate this new reality. The man had disrupted everything she had believed to be true about people like him. The man, still standing tall, didn't speak again. He didn't need to. His presence in that room had already done more than words could ever achieve. The judge looked at him, a mix of frustration and admiration on her face. She was conflicted. On one hand, she had built her career on rules and procedures, on fairness dictated by law. But on the other, there was something deeply personal about the challenge this man had just presented to her. As the silence stretched on, the judge finally sat down, her hands shaking slightly as she adjusted the papers before her. She glanced at the jury, whose faces now seemed more open, more thoughtful. They too had witnessed a transformation. The man had shown them more than just his identity. He had shown them the power of conviction and the importance of seeing beyond one's initial assumptions. I need a moment," the judge muttered, her voice shaky. She took a deep breath, but there was a hesitation in her actions. The courtroom was no longer just a place where cases were tried. It was a place of reflection. The man had forced everyone to look beyond the surface, to question the way they viewed the world and those who lived in it. The defense attorney's eyes softened as he watched the judge. He had seen this before, in other places and other trials. The moment when someone's beliefs were challenged, and they were forced to reckon with their own bias. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And the man standing in front of the judge had just made it clear that no one was exempt from this reckoning. The judge took another deep breath, her thoughts swirling. She had always prided herself on being above the emotions of the case, on being able to separate her personal feelings from her decisions. But now, with the weight of the man's gaze on her, she realized that was impossible. He had made her confront a truth she couldn't ignore. That sometimes, what truly matters goes far beyond the facts and figures presented in a trial. Finally, she lifted her gaze back to the man. The moment had arrived, and she knew that whatever decision she made next would shape not only this case, but also the way she viewed herself moving forward. The judge took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving the man who stood before her. For a long moment, she remained silent, unsure of how to proceed. She had seen countless defendants, heard their stories, and made her decisions based on what the law told her was right. But now she was facing something she had never expected. A man who had not only challenged the law, but also her own beliefs. Her mind raced. Could she continue to follow the rules that had guided her career, or was it time to question them? Was it enough to simply be impartial, or did true justice require seeing beyond the surface? The courtroom felt different now, like a space where the rules no longer had the final say. The man standing in front of her had shown them all that there was more to justice than just the letter of the law. The defense attorney, sensing that the judge was struggling, spoke up again, his voice calm and persuasive. "Your Honor, the man before you is more than just a defendant in this case. He is a person who has faced more challenges than most could even imagine. And yet here he is, standing tall, asking for nothing but fairness. I believe he has earned that much, don't you?" The words seemed to hang in the air, and for the first time, the judge considered them fully. She thought of all the times she had looked at a case and made a decision based on what was expected of her. She had always believed that her job was to maintain order and fairness in the courtroom, to follow the rules without letting emotions get in the way. But now, she wasn't sure if that was enough. As she sat there, the man continued to stand, his expression calm and composed. It was as if he knew the weight of this moment, and he was willing to let it unfold in its own time. His patience, his silence, made her question everything. How had she allowed herself to become so focused on the surface details of each case, without considering the deeper humanity of the people in front of her? The prosecutor, who had been silent up until now, cleared her throat. "Your Honor, I believe we should proceed. The law is clear, and we must follow the procedures." Her words were rushed, as if she feared the judge's hesitation might lead to a decision that could disrupt everything they had worked for. But the judge didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked at the jury, who had been watching the exchange with rapt attention. They, too, seemed to be waiting for something, waiting to see how the judge would handle the situation. The man had made them see him differently, and they couldn't ignore that. The judge's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the gavel. But as her fingers hovered over it, she realized something. It wasn't about following the law or maintaining control. It was about doing what was right. The man had shown her that sometimes the truth was more important than procedure, and fairness didn't always come in the form of a strict judgment. It came in recognizing the humanity of others, no matter what they looked like, where they came from, or what they had been through. She looked back at the man, her expression softening. The room was quiet, waiting for her decision. The pressure of the moment hung heavily in the air, but she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't felt before. It was as if the walls of the courtroom had fallen away, and all that was left was the truth. The man had revealed it to them, and now it was her turn to act on it. With a final breath, The judge placed her hand on the gavel, but instead of bringing it down with force, she simply let it rest there. It wasn't a decision that could be rushed. It was a moment of reflection, a moment where she realized that true justice was about seeing people for who they truly were, not just as cases or statistics. The judge sat quietly, her mind still racing. The courtroom felt like a place out of time, as if the usual rules and routines had disappeared. Everyone was watching her, waiting for her to make a decision, but this wasn't just about the trial anymore. This was about something deeper, something that had challenged her understanding of justice itself. The man had stood up, not just physically, but metaphorically, demanding that everyone see him as a person, not a label. He had opened her eyes in a way that no one had before. She had always prided herself on being fair, but now she wondered if she had been too focused on the law, and not enough on the people it was meant to protect. The room remained silent, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. The defense attorney, who had been quiet for some time, stepped forward again, his voice gentle but strong. "Your Honor," he said, "I believe the man standing before you has already shown his true character. He is not defined by his disability, nor by the color of his skin. He is defined by the strength he has shown in overcoming the obstacles life has placed in his path. And that is something that deserves respect." The judge felt the truth of his words deep in her chest. The man had faced challenges that many people could not even imagine, yet here he was, standing tall, demanding to be treated with dignity. She couldn't ignore that. The weight of the law, which she had always held onto so tightly, seemed less important now. What mattered more was recognizing the humanity in front of her. Her gaze shifted to the jury. They were no longer just passive observers. They had been part of this moment too. The man's words had reached them, just as they had reached the judge. She could see it in their eyes. Something had changed. They had been forced to look at him differently, and in doing so, they had to look at themselves differently as well. The prosecutor, who had been silent for some time, finally spoke. "Your Honor, we can't ignore the facts. We have to follow the law." Her voice was strained, as though she knew the truth of the situation, but couldn't bring herself to admit it. The judge understood. It was difficult to let go of the belief that everything could be explained by the law. But now she wasn't sure if that was enough. The judge stood up slowly, her gaze never leaving the defendant. She had spent her career relying on rules, but today those rules were being tested. She cleared her throat, preparing herself to speak. The moment felt significant, like the kind of moment where the world could change depending on what was said next. "I have listened to everyone," she began, her voice steady but full of emotion. "And I believe that this case is not just about the law. It is about understanding who we are as people and how we treat one another. The man before us has shown more courage and strength than many people ever will. And I cannot ignore that." The words felt strange, yet right. The judge, who had always believed in following the law above all else, was now questioning her own understanding of justice. She wasn't ready to pass judgment based solely on the letter of the law anymore. It wasn't just about the facts. It was about the person standing in front of her, and the kind of world she wanted to help create. The courtroom was silent again, but this time, the silence felt different. It wasn't one of tension or uncertainty. It was a silence of understanding, of a new awareness dawning on everyone present. The judge had spoken, but the real work was only just beginning. This moment had opened her eyes, and now she knew she had to make a decision that went beyond what she had ever done before. The courtroom remained still, as if time had slowed down. The judge stood at her podium, her mind racing through the decision she had to make. She had spent so many years in this role, following the rules, maintaining control, and making judgments. But today, for the first time, she felt uncertain. The man who stood before her had forced her to confront her own biases, to see beyond what she had always known. As the judge's eyes scanned the courtroom, she noticed the expressions on the faces around her. The prosecutor, who had once seemed so sure of her case, now looked hesitant, uncertain. The defense attorney stood with quiet confidence, knowing that the man had already won the battle for dignity. And the jury, they had witnessed it all, and she could see the change in their eyes. They were no longer just evaluating a case. They had witnessed something greater than that, something that made them think about what justice really meant. The man, still standing tall, had not spoken again. He had said all he needed to say. His words had done more than just defend his innocence. They had challenged everyone in the room to reflect on their own perceptions. His silence now was powerful, a reminder that he had already shown the world who he was. The judge's heart felt heavy as she took a deep breath. She had always believed that her job was to be objective, to make decisions based on the law and the evidence. But now, the lines between law and humanity seemed blurred. The law was important, but it was the people who lived within it who mattered most. She cleared her throat and finally spoke, her voice firm but tinged with emotion. "I have listened to everything that has been said today," she began, "and I have seen more than just the facts of this case. I have seen a man who has fought every day of his life, a man who has shown strength in the face of adversity, and that is something that deserves to be acknowledged." She paused, her eyes meeting the defendant's once again. His gaze was steady, unflinching. He didn't need to say anything else. His very presence had spoken volumes. "Justice is not just about following the rules," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "It is about understanding, about seeing people for who they truly are. And it is about fairness, not just in the way we treat others, but in the way we see them." The room seemed to breathe in unison, the tension that had filled the air finally beginning to dissipate. The judge looked at the man before her one more time. He was not just a defendant. He was a symbol, a reminder that the law was not meant to be a cold, impersonal system. It was meant to protect people, to ensure that everyone was treated with respect and dignity. She felt a weight lift from her shoulders as she reached for the gavel. This was the moment. She knew what she had to do. Her decision wasn't just about the man in front of her. It was about everyone who had ever been judged unfairly, everyone who had ever felt the sting of bias or prejudice. The judge brought the gavel down with a quiet but decisive motion. "In light of everything I have witnessed here today, I find that this case is not about the defendant's guilt or innocence. It is about the failure of the system to see him for who he truly is. I hereby rule in favor of the defendant." A murmur ran through the room. The prosecutor's eyes widened, but she said nothing. The defense attorney gave a small nod of approval. The jury looked at each other, silently acknowledging the shift that had just occurred. The man, still standing, did not react immediately, but there was a quiet sense of satisfaction in his eyes. He had not just won his case, he had won something greater. He had made everyone see him for who he truly was. The judge looked at him one last time, her heart full. This moment, this decision, was not just about him. It was about all of them, and the world they all shared. The courtroom was quiet, the air still charged with the weight of the judge's decision. The man who had stood so bravely, who had challenged not just his case, but everyone's perception, remained calm, though a faint glimmer of relief shone in his eyes. The judge had ruled in his favor, but it wasn't just about the verdict. It was the moment, the realization, that had shifted everything in that room. As the gavel echoed in the silence, the man slowly sat down, his hands resting in his lap. He was no longer just a defendant in a case. He had become a symbol of something much bigger. The judge, having made her decision, felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't the peace that came from following the law perfectly, but the kind that came from doing what she knew was right. The defense attorney walked over to the man, offering him a respectful nod. Though no words were necessary, they both understood what had just happened. The courtroom had witnessed something transformative. It was a victory, not just for the man, but for fairness, for seeing people beyond the labels and assumptions placed upon them. The prosecutor, still somewhat in shock, gathered her notes, clearly struggling to process the outcome. She had never expected this case to take the turn it had. She had always seen it as just another trial, another routine job. But now, it felt as though the world had shifted. The law, as much as it had shaped her life, wasn't the only thing that mattered. Human dignity and respect were far more important. The judge took a moment to look around the room. The jury, who had witnessed the man's powerful stand, now looked thoughtful, reflective. The expressions on their faces showed that they too had been affected by the events of the day. They had seen someone rise above adversity, someone who had fought not just for justice, but for the recognition of his humanity. "Today we've all learned something," the judge said, her voice soft but clear. "It's easy to judge people based on what we see. We can't help but make assumptions about others based on their appearance, their background, or their circumstances. But we must remember that every person has a story, a life that goes far beyond the surface." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. The room was silent once more, but this silence felt different. It wasn't one of tension, but of contemplation. "I hope that this case will serve as a reminder to all of us that justice is not just about following the rules. It's about recognizing the value of every individual, regardless of their differences." The man, hearing the judge's words, allowed a small smile to appear on his face. It wasn't a smile of triumph, but one of quiet satisfaction. He had fought not just for his own justice, but for a chance to make people see beyond their preconceived notions. He knew that today's victory wasn't just about him. It was a small step toward changing how people thought, how they treated others. As the judge left the bench, she looked back one last time at the man who had stood so confidently in her courtroom. She could no longer see him as just a disabled black man. She saw him as a person who had shown her what true strength and courage looked like. The courtroom began to empty, the people filing out in silence, each one carrying with them the weight of the lesson they had learned that day. For some, it would be a fleeting memory. For others, it would be a turning point, a moment that changed the way they saw the world. The man stood up once more, this time with a sense of calm assurance. As he walked out of the courtroom, he didn't just leave as a man who had won a case. He left as a man who had shown everyone the true meaning of justice and the importance of seeing people for who they really were.